the Silk Road's greatest storyteller. On his deathbed in Venice, as January winds howled through the canal-side palazzo, Marco Polo faced his final inquisition. A priest, hovering over the dying merchant, begged him to recant the fantastic tales that had made him famous. Stories of paper money and burning black stones, of armies that communicated through smoke signals, and a king who dined from golden plates in a palace roofed with pure gold. The year was 1324, and even after decades, many Venetians still refused to believe the accounts of his 24 years in the mysterious East. Marco, his breathing labored but his mind sharp as ever, fixed the priest with the same keen gaze that had once earned the trust of the most powerful man in the world, Kublai Khan. "Reverend Father," he whispered, "I have not told half of what I saw." These would become his most famous words, and perhaps his most honest. For in an age when most Europeans imagined the world ended at Jerusalem, Marco Polo had ventured into the heart of Asia and returned to tell the tale. He had crossed burning deserts where phantom armies appeared in the shimming heat, scaled the ice-clad Pamirs that pierced the roof of the world, and navigated the treacherous waters of the South China Sea. He had served as the eyes and ears of the great Khan himself, traversing an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Carpathian Mountains. And in doing so, he became the first European to document the wonders of a civilization far more advanced than his own. But Marco Polo was more than just a traveler. He was the first great bridge between East and West, a man who showed Europeans that the world was far larger, far richer, and far more extraordinary than they had ever imagined. His story, equal parts merchant's account, diplomatic report, and adventure tale, would inspire generations of explorers, including Christopher Columbus, who carried a heavily annotated copy of Marco's book on his voyage to the New World. This is the tale of a young man who left Venice at age 17 with nothing but his father's name and his own burning curiosity, and returned 24 years later, having seen more of the world than any European before him. It is a story of adventure and intrigue, of father and son, of power and ambition. But above all, it is the story of how one man's journey helped two vastly different civilizations begin to see each other not through the lens of legend and fear, but through the eyes of experience and understanding. Let us begin where Marco himself began, in the glittering, ambitious, cutthroat world of 13th century Venice, where a teenage boy was about to embark on the greatest adventure in history. Marco Polo, the boy in the floating city. The bells of San Marco tolled across a city built on water, their bronze songs echoing off marble palaces and dancing across the rippling canals. For young Marco Polo, these bells marked more than just the hours. They rang out the rhythms of the greatest maritime empire of the 13th century. Venice in the 1260s was a place where fortunes rose and fell with the tides, where merchants' galleys brought spices from Alexandria and silk from Constantinople, and where a clever boy could learn more about the wider world from an afternoon at the Rialto markets than from a year of studying charts and maps. Marco navigated this floating metropolis like a fish in the lagoon, darting through narrow alleyways and over countless bridges, pausing only to watch the great trading vessels slide past the arsenale's towering walls. The shipyard's armies of workers could assemble a fully equipped galley in a single day, a feat that seemed like magic to the boy, who would one day sail on such ships to the edges of the known world. But there was one sight that always stopped him in his tracks: the foreign merchants who thronged the Rialto. Turbaned Turks haggled over the price of Murano glass, Armenian traders displayed shimmering silks, and Greek sailors swapped tales of distant shores over cups of Cypriot wine. Young Marco absorbed their strange tongues like a sponge, collecting words in Arabic, Greek, and Turkish the way other boys collected shells or stones. Each new phrase was a key that might one day unlock the mysteries of distant lands. Home for Marco was his uncle's palazzo near the church of San Giovanni Crisostomo, where he lived with his aunt and female cousins. His mother had died in his infancy, the first of many losses that would shape his life. His father, Niccolo, was little more than a name whispered at family gatherings and a few dusty letters stored in his uncle's counting house. While other boys learned their trades at their father's sides, Marco learned his from ledgers and letters, from eavesdropping on merchants' conversations, and from the stories his uncle told of the Polo family's trading ventures. The Polos were not among Venice's oldest or noblest families. They had earned their place through cunning and courage, pushing their trading networks ever eastward while other merchants stayed close to familiar shores. Marco's grandfather had established the family's first trading post in Constantinople, and his father and uncle had pressed even further, venturing into the mysterious lands beyond the Black Sea. But of his father's current whereabouts, Marco knew nothing. The last letter had come 3 years ago, sent from a place with an unpronounceable name somewhere in the lands of the Tartars. At 15, Marco was already showing the traits that would later serve him so well in the courts of Kublai Khan. He had his father's height and his mother's quick wit, combined with an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. The currency changers at the Rialto learned to watch for him, this tall youth with the sharp eyes who could spot a clipped coin at 20 paces. The spice merchants learned to hide their best goods when he came to browse their stalls, not because he would steal, but because he could too easily tell the difference between true cinnamon and its cheaper cousins. Yet for all his precocious talents, Marco was a boy set apart. While his peers dreamed of commanding trading galleys or winning seats on the Great Council, he dreamed of the father he had never known and the lands that had swallowed him. Each evening he would climb to the roof of his uncle's palazzo and stare east across the lagoon, past the Lido's protective barrier islands toward the open sea. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, beyond the familiar waters of the Adriatic, his father and uncle were traveling through lands no Venetian had ever seen. He could not have known then that his own journey would dwarf theirs, that he would one day stand in the greatest court on earth, travel through lands that were barely rumors in Venice, and return with tales that would change how Europe saw the world. All he knew on those quiet evenings above the canals was that the life of an ordinary Venetian merchant, no matter how wealthy or respected, would never be enough. In the spring of 1269, everything changed. Word reached Venice that 2 long-lost merchants had returned from the east with tales that seemed impossible. They spoke of a great emperor who ruled over hundreds of millions of souls, of cities larger than 10 Venices combined, and of a journey that had taken them to the very edges of the world. When Marco heard their names, his heart nearly stopped. Niccolo and Marco Polo had come home. The journey to the east, Marco Polo's awakening. The 2 men who stepped off the galley from Constantinople bore little resemblance to the prosperous merchants who had left Venice 15 years earlier. Their once fine clothes were worn to threads, their skin weathered dark by foreign suns. They spoke their native Venetian with strange accents, occasionally slipping into incomprehensible tongues when common words eluded them. But it was their eyes that truly marked them as changed men. They had seen things that no European had witnessed before, and that knowledge had transformed them. Niccolo Polo's first sight of his son was in the crowded courtyard of the family palazzo. Marco stood a head taller than his cousins, nearly a man grown. For a moment, father and son stared at each other across 15 years of absence, neither quite sure how to bridge that vast divide. Then Niccolo did something that shocked the assembled family. He bowed to his son, a gesture of respect typically reserved for nobles and dignitaries. "You have your mother's eyes," he said simply. That evening, as the family gathered in the great hall, Niccolo and his brother Maffeo unspooled a tale that seemed to belong more to legend than reality. They spoke of crossing the great grasslands of the Tartars, where a man could ride for 100 days and see nothing but sky and grass. They described cities of unimaginable wealth in Bukhara and Samarkand, where scholars preserved the lost knowledge of the ancient world in vast libraries. But it was their audience with Kublai Khan, the supreme lord of the Mongol Empire, that silenced even the most skeptical listeners. The Khan ruled over the largest empire ever created, stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea. In his capital at Xanadu, he hosted ambassadors from every corner of the known world, and some corners that Europeans had never imagined existed. He questioned us for hours about the Christian lands, Maffeo explained, about our customs, our rulers, and especially about our Holy Father, the Pope. Never have I met a man of such curiosity, such intelligence, or such power, Niccolò added quietly. He commands armies larger than all the forces of Europe combined. His word can raise cities or raise empires. And yet, he paused, glancing at his son. And yet, what impressed him most was our willingness to learn, to observe, to understand. The brothers had spent years in the Khan's service, traveling his vast domains as his agents. But it was their final audience with him that had sent them racing back to Venice. Kublai Khan had made them an extraordinary request. He wanted 100 learned men from the Christian world to teach his people about Western science and faith. In return, he offered riches beyond imagination and his personal protection along the Silk Road. "We carry letters from the great Khan himself," Niccolò announced, producing a golden tablet marked with strange symbols, the Khan's paisa, a diplomatic passport that commanded all his subjects to aid its bearer. "But we must return within 2 years. The Khan's patience is as vast as his empire, but it is not endless." As the family debated the implications of this imperial request, Marco watched his father with hungry eyes. He saw how the other merchants at the table leaned forward when Niccolò spoke of trade opportunities in Cathay, how they calculated the fortunes that might be made. But he also saw something they missed, the way his father's hand kept returning to a weathered leather pouch at his belt, as if reassuring himself that its contents were still there. Later that night, unable to sleep, Marco found his father standing on the palazzo's roof, staring east, just as Marco had done so many times before. Without turning, Niccolò spoke. "There are things I couldn't say below. Things about the Khan's true intentions, about the powers aligning against him within his own court. The 100 learned men are only part of what he seeks." He turned to face his son. "The Khan needs eyes he can trust. Men who can see clearly and report truthfully without the prejudices of his own courtiers." "And you trust me?" Marco asked, voicing the doubt that had haunted him since their first meeting. Niccolò's answer changed the course of both their lives. "I've watched you all day, Marco. I've seen how you read people, how you notice things others miss. In you, I see what the Khan seeks." He opened the leather pouch and withdrew a handful of strange cards covered in intricate markings. "These are maps of lands no European has seen. Lands we'll cross together if you have the courage to come with us." Marco took the maps with trembling hands. They depicted vast mountain ranges, endless deserts, and cities with names he couldn't pronounce. But it wasn't the exotic locations that made his heart race. It was the blank spaces between them, the areas marked only with tantalizing questions. Here be giants? Gateway to paradise? Kingdom of women? "When do we leave?" Marco asked. His father smiled for the first time since returning to Venice. "As soon as you're ready to become something more than just a merchant's son." 2 weeks later, Pope Gregory X finally granted them an audience at his court in Acre. But instead of 100 learned men, he could spare only 2 Dominican friars for the journey to the court of Kublai Khan. It was far less than the Khan had asked for, but it was enough to justify their return. And this time, they would take with them a young man whose keen eyes and quick mind would change how 2 worlds saw each other. Marco Polo was going to Cathay, Marco Polo's transformative journey. Spring storms lashed the Mediterranean as the Polo family's galley slipped out of Acre's ancient harbor. Marco stood at the rail, watching the last familiar shore disappear into darkness. At 17, he carried little from his old life, a leather-bound journal, a few precious instruments for navigation, and his father's warnings about the road ahead. "The journey you imagined," Niccolò had told him, "is not the journey we face." Those words proved prophetic before they even reached Armenia. Their Dominican companions, the Pope's chosen emissaries to the Great Khan, abandoned the expedition at the port of Ayas, terrified by rumors of war along the Silk Road. But where others saw danger, the Polos saw opportunity. Without the need to protect and escort the friars, they could take riskier routes, paths that might yield both greater profits and greater adventures. Their first test came in the mountains of Kurdistan. Summer heat had driven scorpions and vipers from their dens, forcing the caravan to travel by night. Marco learned to sleep in the saddle, guided by starlight and the ghostly flames of distant natural gas vents that the locals called eternal fires. When bandits ambushed them in a narrow pass, he discovered that the true currency of survival wasn't gold, but observation, noticing the fresh hoofprints in the dust, the unusual silence of birds, the slight shift in their guide's posture that signaled danger. At Tabriz, the great marketplace of Persia, Marco received his first lesson in the art of diplomatic survival. The Ilkhan Abaga, grandson of Genghis Khan, held court in a palace that combined Mongol martial simplicity with Persian splendor. Here, Marco watched his father and uncle navigate the treacherous waters of international commerce and politics. A wrong word or misplaced gesture could cost not just a sale, but a life. "Watch their eyes, not their hands," Maffeo taught him as they negotiated for rubies with a Persian merchant. "The hands may lie, but the eyes always tell the truth." The true hardships began when they left the established trade routes. Their small party crossed the Dasht-e-Kavir, Persia's great salt desert, where the ground cracked like broken pottery and mirages danced on the horizon. They lost 2 horses and nearly died of thirst before finding an underground qanat system, ancient Persian waterways that ran for miles beneath the baking earth. In the Hindu Kush, where the air grew too thin to breathe, Marco suffered his first hallucinations. The mountains seemed to move in the moonlight, and the wind carried voices that spoke in tongues he'd never heard. A local Buddhist monk, finding him delirious with altitude sickness, taught him meditation techniques that would later save his life in the Gobi Desert. "The mind sees what it expects to see," the monk told him. "Learn to empty your cup of expectations and you can fill it with truth." But it was in Balkh, the mother of cities, where Marco truly began to transform from observer to chronicler. In the ruins of this ancient metropolis, once home to Greek philosophers and Buddhist monks, he filled his journal with increasingly detailed observations. He noted not just the architecture and trade goods, but the ways people lived, how they prepared their food, treated their sick, celebrated their marriages, buried their dead. One evening, as they sheltered in the shell of an abandoned palace, Nicola found his son sketching the intricate patterns of a shattered mosaic. "You see things differently now," he observed. Marco nodded, not looking up from his work. "The world is bigger than our maps suggest. And smaller too." "How so?" "The same patterns appear everywhere, in the tiles here, in the carpets of Kerman, in the stories people tell. Different colors, different materials, but the same human heart underneath." Nicolas studied his son's face in the fading light. The soft-cheeked boy of Venice was gone, replaced by a lean, sun-darkened young man with calculating eyes and calloused hands. "You're ready," he said quietly. "Ready?" "For what lies ahead?" "The Gobi Desert, the Kingdom of Cathay, the court of the great Khan himself." He pointed to Marco's journal. "You'll be his eyes in places even he has never seen. And someday, you'll be the world's eyes in places they've never imagined." That night, Marco dreamed of Venice for the last time. When he woke, the city of his childhood felt as distant as the moon. Ahead lay the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, and beyond them, the endless steppes of Mongolia. They had been traveling for 2 years, and their journey was not even half complete. But Marco no longer cared about the destination. He had discovered something far more valuable than the trade goods they carried, or even the great Khan's favor. He had found his true purpose, to see the world not as others imagined it, but as it truly was. Dawn found him already in the saddle, facing east. In his journal, he wrote words that would echo through centuries. "I have seen wonders that defy description, and I am not yet 20. What glories await in the lands ahead? What mysteries? What truths? Let those who have eyes to see. The court of Kublai Khan, a Venetian's journey into the heart of an empire. Summer lightning flickered across the plains of Xanadu as Marco Polo caught his first glimpse of power incarnate. Kublai Khan's summer palace rose from the grasslands like a dream, its golden pavilions and marble halls surrounded by parks where snow-white horses grazed and trained cheetahs prowled on silver chains. But it was the silence that struck him first. 3,000 miles of travel had accustomed him to the constant noise of caravans and markets, yet here, at the heart of the world's largest empire, a hush fell over even the wind. Guards in lacquered armor stood motionless as statues. Courtiers glided across polished floors without a whisper of silk against stone. The great Khan's chamberlain met them in an antechamber decorated with jade and lapis lazuli. He spoke 7 languages and had memorized the lineages of every noble family from Armenia to Korea, yet he stumbled over the pronunciation of Polo. Marco suppressed a smile. Here, at last, was something his father hadn't prepared him for. In this court, they were the barbarians. "His Majesty is occupied with affairs of state," the chamberlain announced. "You will wait." They waited for 3 days. Marco used every moment to observe the endless parade of supplicants and ambassadors. Proud Arabs in flowing robes, Korean scholars clutching astronomical charts, Russian princes bearing sable furs, Indian mystics who claimed to levitate, but notably walked to their audiences. Each carried tribute, each sought favor, and each departed with the same dazed expression, as if they'd stared too long at the sun. On the 4th morning, as dawn painted the sky the color of jade, they were summoned. Kublai Khan sat not on a throne, but on a raised platform covered in black leopard skins. He was shorter than Marco had imagined, and fatter, with a gray-streaked beard and eyes that seemed to change color in the shifting light. Those eyes fixed on Marco with unexpected intensity. "So," the Khan said in perfect Persian, "Niccolo Polo brings me his son." He gestured for Marco to approach. "They say you have learned our ways quickly. That you speak our tongues. That you watch everything with the eyes of a hawk. Are you a spy then, young Venetian?" The court held its breath. Marco felt the weight of 1,000 stares. His father had warned him never to lie to the Khan, but he hadn't advised what truth to tell. "Great Khan," Marco replied in Mongolian, his accent perfect after months of practice. "I am whatever you wish me to be. But know this. A spy sees only what he is looking for. I see everything." A dangerous silence followed. Then Kublai Khan threw back his head and laughed, a sound like distant thunder. "Prove it," he commanded. "Tell me what you see in my court." Marco didn't hesitate. "I see a messenger from Tibet who arrived before dawn. The mud on his boots is still wet, and only the mountain passes would have such red clay. I see that your falconer is stealing from you. His sleeves are weighted with grain meant for your birds. And I see that you, Great Khan, are testing me. Your right hand rests near your dagger, but your left fingers tap the pattern of a children's counting game. You are both amused and wary, like a man watching a clever monkey perform tricks." The court erupted in shocked whispers. The falconer fell to his knees, babbling confessions. But Kublai Khan only smiled. "And what do you see beyond these walls, Marco Polo?" "I see an empire too vast for one man to know. Even a man as great as you." "Ah," the Khan's eyes glittered. "Now you see my problem. And perhaps your purpose." That evening, Marco was assigned quarters in the inner palace, an honor unprecedented for a foreign merchant. His windows overlooked gardens where mechanical birds sang from golden trees, and his rooms were heated by coal burning in underground furnaces, a marvel he'd never seen in Europe. But it was the Khan's private summons that truly marked the beginning of his new life. In a chamber illuminated only by phosphorescent stones brought from the mountains of Tibet, Kublai Khan shared his vision. "My ministers tell me what they think I wish to hear," he said. "My generals tell me what serves their ambitions. My scholars recite only what is written in ancient books. But you, young Venetian, you will tell me what is." And so began Marco's real education. The Khan set him impossible tasks: travel to the cities of the south and learn why their silk production had fallen. Visit the western provinces and report on the mood of the people. Study the postal relay system and find its weaknesses. Each mission was a test, each report a chance to fail. But Marco had one advantage his rivals didn't understand. He had no preconceptions to cloud his vision. Where Chinese scholars saw barbarian customs, he saw practical solutions to age-old problems. Where Mongol generals saw only territory to conquer, he saw networks of trade and influence that could bind an empire together. His reports grew from mere observations into philosophical discussions with the Khan himself. Late into the night, they would debate the nature of government, the role of commerce, the future of East and West. Kublai Khan found in Marco something he'd never expected from a European, a mind as curious and unconventional as his own. "You know," the Khan told him one evening as they watched the sun set over the steppes, "in all my empire there is no one quite like you, Marco Polo. My Chinese ministers think you're a barbarian who has learned to wear silk. My Mongol generals think you're a scholar who has learned to ride. Even your father doesn't quite understand what you've become." Marco thought carefully before responding. "And what have I become, great Khan?" Kublai smiled that inscrutable smile that had launched 1,000 campaigns. "You have become my eyes on the world, young Venetian. And now I will show you things that no European has ever seen." Marco Polo, the Emperor's Eyes and His Missions. The city of Hangzhou burned beneath a summer sun as Marco followed the trail of missing astronomers. 3 of the Khan's finest scholars had vanished while studying an eclipse, leaving behind only cryptic notes about celestial harmonies and the mandate of heaven. It was Marco's first solo mission for Kublai Khan, and already he suspected he was being watched. "The Son of Heaven requires accuracy," the Khan had told him, using the Chinese imperial title. "Find what happened to my astronomers. And Marco, trust no one's eyes but your own." The investigation led him through a labyrinth of competing interests. Chinese nobles resented the Mongol overlords. Buddhist monks whispered of celestial omens. Arab traders spoke of mysterious ships arriving in the dead of night. But it was a peculiar detail in a merchant's ledger that broke the case: astronomical instruments being shipped south, disguised as agricultural tools. The missing scholars hadn't been murdered, they'd been recruited. A rival court in Champa was building its own observatory, hoping to challenge the Khan's mandate through mastery of the heavens. Marco's report saved 3 lives and prevented a diplomatic crisis. More importantly, it revealed the deep tensions between Chinese tradition and Mongol power, tensions that would shape his future missions. The Khan's next assignment took him to the Silk Road's most treacherous passage. Caravans were disappearing in the mountains between Dunhuang and Khotan. Local officials blamed bandits, but Marco discovered an elaborate conspiracy. Corrupt administrators had allied with nomadic tribes, sharing profits from hijacked trade goods. His solution was pure Venetian pragmatism. Instead of punishing the tribes, he helped the Khan incorporate them into the imperial postal system. The former raiders became paid guides and guards. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain transformed from a threat into an asset. But it was in the southeastern provinces that Marco faced his greatest challenge. The Khan dispatched him to investigate why the region's legendary salt production had plummeted. The answer lay not in corruption or incompetence, but in an invisible revolution. Local merchants had discovered that paper money could be more valuable than salt. They were hoarding physical currency and manipulating exchange rates, creating artificial shortages that threatened the empire's financial stability. Marco's report on the salt crisis became required reading for imperial administrators. In it, he explained not just the economics of the situation, but its deeper implications. He had witnessed something unprecedented in human history: the emergence of complex financial markets in an empire still transitioning from barter to paper currency. "Money," he wrote to the Khan, "moves like wind through your empire." Like wind, it cannot be seen, only its effects can be measured. And like wind, it knows no borders. The Khan rewarded Marco's insights with increasingly sensitive assignments. He surveyed the Grand Canal, suggesting improvements that would speed grain shipments to the northern capitals. He documented the use of coal for heating in Kaifeng, describing technologies that would not appear in Europe for centuries. In Quanzhou, he studied shipbuilding techniques that made Chinese vessels the most advanced in the world. Each mission added layers to his understanding of how the empire functioned. The Khan's realm was not simply held together by force of arms, but by an intricate web of technological innovations, administrative systems, and cultural accommodations. Marco documented it all, filling journal after journal with observations that ranged from military dispositions to recipes for exotic fruits. But his most significant mission began with a seemingly simple request: travel to the southwestern frontier and determine if the reports of men with tails were true. The assignment took him into the remote regions of Yunnan, where the empire's grip was tenuous and the boundaries between fact and folklore blurred. He found no tailed men, but he discovered something far more valuable: a network of trade routes connecting the empire to the kingdoms of Burma and India. These paths, later dubbed the Tea-Horse Road, could provide alternative routes for commerce if the traditional Silk Road were ever disrupted. The Khan was impressed not just by the strategic implications of Marco's discovery, but by the detailed ethnographic information he provided about the region's peoples. Marco had documented their customs, their technologies, their methods of warfare and peacemaking. He drew maps that showed not just geography, but cultural boundaries, trade relationships, and seasonal migrations. "You see my empire as I wish I could see it," the Khan told him one evening, "not as a collection of conquered territories, but as a living thing, with its own rhythms and reasons." After 6 years of such missions, Marco had become more than just the Khan's eyes. He was his interpreter of worlds. He understood both the grand patterns of imperial politics and the intimate details of daily life that made the empire function. His reports weren't just documents, they were windows into a world that Europeans had never imagined existed. But his greatest test still lay ahead. The Khan was preparing to send him on a mission that would challenge not just his skills of observation, but his deepest loyalties. A Chinese princess needed escort to a distant court, and Marco Polo, the barbarian who had learned to see with imperial eyes, would be her guardian on a journey that would change both their lives forever. The Princess and the Journey Home, a tale of diplomacy and adventure. The green jade waves of the South China Sea lifted the imperial fleet's massive treasure ships on a sultry morning in 1291. Aboard the flagship, Princess Kokachin clutched a jade pendant, her last gift from Kublai Khan. Marco watched her from the quarterdeck, remembering the Khan's private warning. "She carries more than just our honor to Persia. She carries the future of 2 empires." The princess was not what she seemed. Though her title was real, her mission encompassed far more than a diplomatic marriage. In her retinue's baggage lay encrypted messages, maps of military installations, and trade agreements that could reshape the balance of power from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. Marco's true assignment was not merely to protect her, but to ensure these secrets reached only their intended recipients. Their fleet of 14 ships carried enough armed men to conquer a small kingdom, but numbers meant nothing against the sea. Off the coast of Champa, they encountered their first test, a typhoon that scattered the fleet like autumn leaves. Marco's years of studying Chinese navigation techniques proved crucial. He had learned to read the subtle changes in wave patterns, the flight of seabirds, and the color of clouds that presaged storms. While other ships fled for shelter, he guided the flagship through the typhoon's edge, using the storm's own power to speed their journey. Pirates struck near the Strait of Malacca. They emerged from a morning mist in swift proas, their vessels designed for the narrow straits and shallow waters where larger ships dared not venture. But Marco had anticipated this. During his years as the Khan's agent, he'd studied the pirates' tactics, even interviewed captured raiders. He had positioned archers in the ship's blind spots and weighted the fishing nets with ceramic balls, an old Venetian trick that fouled the pirates' rudders. "Your enemies will come at you from their own world," his father had once told him. "Learn to see through their eyes, and you'll see them coming." The victory brought respect from the crew, but created a new problem. The princess, who had maintained proper imperial distance throughout the voyage, now sought his company. During the long evenings at sea, she taught him the secret language of Chinese poetry, where every flower and bird carried hidden meaning. He found himself drawn to her quick mind and quiet strength, even as he knew any attachment would be dangerous. Their conversations took an unexpected turn when she revealed her own secret knowledge of the West. "Tell me, Marco Polo," she said one night, her voice carrying over the wash of waves, "do you truly believe Venice can rival Guangzhou? That your small republic can stand against empires?" Her question cut to the heart of his divided loyalties. After nearly 2 decades in the East, was he still truly Venetian? Or had he become something else, a bridge between worlds that belonged fully to neither? Disease struck the fleet near Ceylon. A mysterious fever swept through the crews, claiming lives daily. When the princess fell ill, Marco remembered a treatment he documented years earlier in Yunnan, a bitter tea made from tree bark that the locals used to fight similar fevers. He had collected samples more out of scholarly interest than medical foresight. Now that curiosity saved lives. The princess recovered, but the delay forced them to winter in Sumatra. There, in the pepper-scented ports of the Spice Islands, they received news that would change everything. Civil war had erupted in their destination of Persia. The original marriage alliance was no longer politically expedient. Marco found himself faced with an impossible choice. The official mission had failed, but the secret dispatches they carried were more vital than ever. And now the princess, whose safety he'd sworn to ensure, was essentially a refugee. It was in this moment of crisis that Marco's unique position, his ability to move between worlds, proved invaluable. He activated networks of traders he'd cultivated over years of travel, arranged new alliances through merchants who owed him favors, and plotted a bold new course. Instead of delivering the princess to a defunct alliance in Persia, they would make for Hormuz, where he knew the political crosscurrents of East and West could offer new opportunities. The gamble paid off. In Hormuz, the princess's knowledge of Chinese statecraft and Marco's understanding of Western politics allowed them to negotiate a new future, one that served both her interests and the Khan's larger strategic goals. She would eventually marry into the Ilkhanate, but on her own terms, maintaining connections that would influence Asian politics for decades. As they prepared to part ways, she pressed a small silk package into his hands. Inside lay a map unlike any he'd ever seen, a Chinese navigation chart showing secret routes through the Indian Ocean. "You gave me back my future," she said. "This may help you find yours." Marco studied the chart's intricate details, recognizing its value not just as a navigation aid, but as a symbol of trust between East and West. He hadn't just succeeded in his mission, he'd helped forge new connections between worlds. But as he watched the princess disappear into the crowd at Hormuz, a familiar restlessness stirred in his heart. After 20 years abroad, Venice called to him like a forgotten dream. He had seen wonders beyond imagination, served the most powerful ruler on earth, and helped shape the destiny of nations. Now it was time to bring those stories home, if home would still have him. He could not have known that his greatest challenge still lay ahead. The tales he carried would prove more dangerous than any storm or pirate. For in medieval Europe, the truth could be the deadliest cargo of all. Marco Polo's captivity and legacy. The clash of steel on steel echoed across the waters of Curzola as Venetian and Genoese galleys locked in combat. Marco stood at the helm of his command, watching his city's proud fleet crumble before their ancient rivals. After surviving 2 decades of Asian deserts, mountains, and seas, he faced death in familiar waters less than 100 miles from home. September 7th, 1298. The battle had begun at dawn when the Genoese admiral Lambadoria caught the Venetian fleet by surprise. Now, as afternoon sun glinted off bloodied waves, Marco saw what the Genoese admirals had known and Venetian commanders had forgotten: how to use the wind as a weapon. The same observational skills that had served him in Kublai Khan's court now showed him the inevitable outcome. Venice would lose this day. His galley was among the last to surrender. As Genoese soldiers clapped him in chains, one of them noticed the curious way he carried himself, neither quite merchant nor quite warrior. "Who are you?" the soldier demanded. "I am Marco Polo." The name meant nothing to his captors. Not yet. They threw him into the dank hold of a Genoese prison galley. As the ship sailed west, he found himself surrounded by the cream of Venice's merchant aristocracy, men who had once mocked his tales of the East as mere fantasy. Now chained in darkness, they begged him for stories to lift their spirits. But it was his cellmate in Genoa's Palazzo di San Giorgio who would change everything. Rustichello da Pisa was a writer of romance novels imprisoned years earlier in one of the endless wars between Italian city-states. In Marco, he recognized something unprecedented, a man whose true stories outshone any fiction. "Tell me about the roof of the world," Rustichello asked one night as rats scurried through moldering straw. "Tell me about the court of the great Khan." Marco hesitated. For years, he had kept his most detailed observations private, aware of their diplomatic and commercial value. But here in the darkness of a Genoese prison, what good were secrets? "Bring me parchment," he said finally. "Bring me ink." "I'll tell you everything." What followed was one of history's most remarkable collaborations. Marco would pace their cell, reciting details of distant lands from memory. The precise number of arches on a stone bridge in Hangzhou, the method of manufacturing porcelain in Jiangxi, the ritual words spoken by Tibetan priests to summon rain. Rustichello, trained in the art of romance, shaped these raw facts into compelling narrative. But tensions arose between storyteller and scribe. Rustichello wanted dragons and magic, the standard fare of medieval romance. Marco insisted on precision, on truth. "Write what I saw," he demanded, "not what you wish I had seen." Their arguments echoed through the prison's stone corridors. Yet from this clash of styles emerged something new, a book that was neither dry merchant's account nor fantastical romance, but a window into worlds beyond European imagination. As word of their work spread through the prison, other inmates began contributing. A Greek sailor added details about Indian Ocean currents. A Jewish merchant corrected Marco's descriptions of Persian trade practices. The book became not just a record of Marco's travels, but a compendium of medieval knowledge about the East. Then came the fever. It swept through the prison in the winter of 1298, claiming lives daily. Marco fell ill, and in his delirium, the worlds he had witnessed blended together. He spoke in a dozen languages, reliving adventures and audiences with kings. The prison doctor, trained in the old Greek methods, declared him beyond hope. But Marco had learned healing arts in his travels that Europe had forgotten. Between bouts of fever, he instructed his cellmates in the preparation of medicinal herbs he documented in Asia. His knowledge saved not only his own life, but those of several fellow prisoners. Recovery brought new clarity. Marco realized that his true legacy would not be the fortunes he'd made or the diplomatic coups he'd achieved, but the knowledge he carried. Every detail mattered, not just the trade routes and political structures, but the small things. How people made paper from bark, distilled alcohol from mare's milk, predicted weather by watching insects. "We must include everything," he told Rustichello. "Future generations must know not just what I saw, but how to see." The manuscript grew. Pages were smuggled out by sympathetic guards, copied by scribes in the city above, and circulated among the curious. Even before its completion, fragments of Marco's tales were spreading across Europe, challenging conventional wisdom about the world's size and nature. Freedom came in 1299 through a diplomatic agreement between Venice and Genoa. But Marco and Rustichello worked for months afterward, refining and expanding their text. The result would be known to history as the Travels of Marco Polo, though its original title was simply The Description of the World. Marco emerged from prison to find himself famous. The book had already begun its journey through medieval Europe's intellectual circles, copied and recopied, translated and retranslated, its influence spreading like ripples in a pond. But fame brought new dangers. In an age when the Church was the arbiter of cosmic truth, Marco's matter-of-fact descriptions of other civilizations' achievements threatened established worldviews. His precise accounts of Chinese technological sophistication, Muslim scientific knowledge, and Buddhist philosophical insights suggested that Christendom was not the sole repository of wisdom. He had survived deserts, storms, and prison. Now he would face his greatest challenge, telling the truth in an age that feared